Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of the book of John. This Bible study is for all of our youth and middle school, high school here at Mount Zion United Methodist Church. And we will post these videos every third Sunday of the month. So this month we are in the second chapter of the book of John. And we see here in the second chapter two, I would say, very familiar stories of Jesus. We have the story of Jesus' first miracle, which, do you know what that is? That's right, Jesus changing water into wine. And then we see later in the chapter one of his most famous stories of being in the temple and just kind of going off and just destroying the money changers and all those that were in the temple, kind of corrupt and making profits off of worshiping God. So this month I hope that you read the second chapter and maybe you jotted some stuff down. I have some things that I'm going to share with you, and I would love to hear what you think about the second chapter of John. So the first miracle that Jesus performs is changing water into wine. And he did this at a wedding. So we don't really know why Jesus chose this as his first miracle. But there's some things in here that I kind of see through studying the Bible. Maybe even some of it points back to the Old Testament. But we see that this is almost a month after Jesus starts his ministry, after he is baptized by John the Baptist. And here, a month later, he's at a wedding that's probably either a family member or someone close, because his mother is there and she's worried because they have run out of wine. And in those days, if you ran out of wine or food at a wedding, really your family would be disgraced because, or thought that maybe you were impoverished or something. For Jewish celebrations, it's always a big event, a big family event, and it's almost when I think about like our Thanksgiving. Where there's just an abundance of food at Thanksgiving for many of our families. And that's kind of what the Jewish tradition here is with weddings. It's almost like food and drink that never ends. You're supposed to have a great time celebrating. And I think it's important that Jesus chose a wedding because he is saying through his miracle how important marriage is. And when we get married in the church, we make a promise between not just the couple being married, but that we are making a promise before God that we will be joined in unity with God and with each other. And that's a beautiful thing. And I think that's why it was important that Jesus performed this first miracle at a wedding. But we see here, when Mary, his mother, asks him, to do something, he says, "Why do you involve me?" It's almost like saying, I don't want to be bothered, or don't bother me with this. I'm at a wedding. I'm here to enjoy it. I shouldn't have to be forced to do something. But Mary knew who Jesus was in her heart. And he tells her, "My time has not yet come," which I think is a very interesting statement to make. And Mary kind of brushes it off, and she tells the servants, "Do whatever this boy tells you to do." Right? Listen to Jesus. And isn't that kind of where we are in our walk with Jesus? We should be listening and doing whatever Jesus tells us to do. We are like servants for Jesus. we should be going out and doing the work that Jesus has called us to do. And maybe we can even see miracles happen, just like these servants did. And not only did he turn water into wine, but we see later on it's the best wine at the wedding. It wasn't cheap wine, but it was good wine. And it stood out. And of course, the servants knew what happened, that it just came from water. And what a miraculous event. Not only did he turn it into wine, but he turned it into the best wine. And we see in the Old Testament, if you go back, I believe like in Jeremiah and in Amos, we see that they prophesied that the wine cups would be overflowing. When the Messiah comes, the wine would just be poured out. And here we see Jesus in the first miracle really confirming those prophecies, that we would see wine flowing. So then the second story here in the second chapter of John is Jesus clearing the temple. And he is angry. And we talked about this, I think we talked about it with the kids. Is anger sin? Well, here Jesus righteously is angry. So he's not sinning. He is disheartened by what the people have turned his temple into. So in the second chapter here of John, we see two different parts of Jesus. We see the miracle worker, and then we see what upsets Jesus. And it's this sin. And he goes in and he just turns over tables, lets loose, the birds and the sheep and the cows that were being sold for sacrifices. And then the Jewish leaders that are there, they demand a miraculous sign. They say, can you prove to us your authority over this? So we see in the first half of this chapter, Jesus is providing a miraculous sign. The second half, people are saying, prove to us through miracles that you are Jesus. So I think this is interesting that this chapter kind of mirrors itself. And he tells them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again. So here we see a foreshadowing of what's to come. Of course, the people thought he really was talking about the Jewish temple. And they almost dismiss him and say, look, it took us 46 years to build this building. There's no way, even if we tore it down, that you could build it up in 3 days. But that's not what Jesus was saying. He was giving them the miraculous sign that if you took his life, he would raise again. And it's interesting because he is here at the temple for Passover. And we'll see later that Passover is the time that he's arrested and crucified and dies. And we think about Passover in the Jewish tradition. They are to go through the house and clean it out and get rid of all of the leavening for the bread. And there is not to be anything that makes bread rise. So that's kind of interesting that Jesus talks about rising from the dead during Passover, when it's a time to remember how they were protected from death. And so the tradition is to get rid of that leavening and to really clean out the whole house. And here, Jesus is cleaning out the temple, right, of all these people that are really sinning or taking advantage of those that want to worship God. And I see him really telling us in this story that We don't need all that stuff to worship God. We need that personal relationship with Him. And these people were missing that. They thought He was talking about a building. He was talking about Himself. And if they had realized what He was talking about, maybe they would have been like the disciples and they would have followed Him as well. So that makes me wonder, how are we following Jesus today? Are we like the servants, listening to what Jesus tells us here? You know, when He tells them to fill the jars with water? Or are we like the religious leaders that can't see what Jesus is saying? My hope is that you are like the servants, and that we are serving God, that we are living like Jesus, that we are going out and doing the work that Jesus called us to do, so that we love like He loved us. And really that would bring peace to our world. And that is a great place to stop here this month as we think about Thanksgiving and how much stuff that we are blessed with. Even in a year that's kind of chaotic, we can find blessing. And we can look at how we can share that blessing with others. So I hope you enjoyed reading the second chapter. Next month, I want you to read the third chapter of the book of John, which has a very, I would say, well-known passage. Can you guess what that passage is in John chapter 3? If you can, send me a comment. I'd love to hear what you all think about reading the book of John. Thanks for joining me this month, and have a safe and happy Thanksgiving.